Hello, everyone, and welcome once again to the Temple Institute Parsha class. My name is Gedalia Meyer, and I'm podcasting from Ma'ale Adumim in Israel. Human beings are perhaps unique in the world as being the only things that possess what we can call perspective. This multi-use word is a way of describing how we see things, and more generally, how we understand them to be. In its simplest form, perspective is purely a visual phenomenon. It is the view we have of a certain thing. It might be from the side or from the back. It might include some depth or it may not. It might be in full color or it may be restricted to black and white. There are an infinite number of variables that could enter into this kind of perspective, but it is still the simplest version. Then we could move deeper and include other senses such as hearing, smell, or touch. We could go further and include emotional states in our perspective. These are also an aspect of the way we perceive things. Observing something while in an angry mood may not be the same as observing it in a joyous mood. If we wish to truly delve into the depths of perspective, we would have to include all manner of possible causes and ramifications. Perspective is not limited to the present scene at hand. It almost always includes some elements of the past and even some of the future. Then we might highlight our artistic creation by including our own personal reaction to whatever it is being observed. How it affects us and how we affect it are essential elements of our perspective on things. What comes out of this is that any two people might not see the exact same thing in the exact same way. In fact, they almost certainly will not see it in the same way. One person watches or witnesses an event, perhaps a car crash or an argument, and sees things unfolding through their own lens of reality. The car crash or the argument may have physical or emotional layers, but another person witnessing that same event may see it through the lens of ultimate purpose or of pointlessness. They may see a car crash or an argument as a destiny-defining event, or as another example of how meaningless everything is. We don't have to be taught how to apply perspective to our view of reality. It seems to be something that comes with the package of the brain and the mind. Whether or not it has always been this way is an interesting question. But what is unquestionable is that at some point in the long road towards becoming fully human, we acquired this remarkable tool which allows us and forces us to see the world with rose-colored or dark-colored or any other colored glasses. We cannot not see the world through these glasses, no matter how much we try to convince ourselves that we can. For better or worse, this is the personal reality of the human mind. The world is never merely as it is, and as an animal might see it. It has an infinite amount of tints and contortions and angles and realities. Perhaps there is a true perspective on things that always eludes us. Perhaps this is the perspective of God, or of dogs, or of a baby. But when creatures as complex as we are put into a world as complex as the one we exist within, things invariably have to go through the complex system of filters that we automatically use to magnify and to obscure everything. The world as it is may occasionally surface in the course of a poem or a hallucinogenic experience. Barring that, we are stuck with our filters and our beliefs. They are our reality more than the bushes or the clouds. The Bible has a great example of perspective. When Moshe saw the burning bush, he turned aside to see what it was that a bush could be burning and yet not consumed. Another person might have missed this completely. They may have been too absorbed in shepherding their sheep or playing their video game to notice this miracle happening right in front of them. The bush, for that matter, might not really have been burning at all. It may have been nothing more than a regular bush, which Moshe happened to be able to pierce through to its true inner nature. For that matter, every bush might be burning, but only those whose filters are set right are able to see. This week's Parsha is called Vayigash, which means, and he approached. It is another title which has little to do with the actual Parsha other than setting the initial scene. In this case, it is Yehuda approaching Joseph to beg for the life of their younger brother Benjamin after he had been caught red-handed with the stolen goblet of Joseph. The background of all this is that the brothers of Joseph, who had sold him as a slave decades earlier, were now forced to bow before him to ask him to sell them food to make it through the years of famine. Joseph puts them through all sorts of trauma, inducing them to reflect back on what they had done 20 odd years earlier. When they left Egypt for the second time with food in their sacks, Joseph had his man put his special goblet in the sack of Benjamin, whom he had specifically demanded be brought to Egypt so that he could see him. This act of framing Benjamin for something that he didn't do, but was unable to defend himself against, was what put them in the current predicament. Yehuda goes through the entire sequence of events that brought them here. He insists that their old father Jacob would die if Benjamin is not brought back to him. He says that he had put himself up as a surety that Benjamin would be safe. But it was all to no avail, as Benjamin seemed guilty of the crime he was accused of. At that point, Joseph finally reveals himself to his brothers. He tells them, quote, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" They couldn't answer him, being terrified and speechless. He then asks them to come closer and tells them that he is Joseph, their brother, whom they sold to Egypt. He then tells them to not be worried over that fateful sale, since it was through that fateful event that he was put into a position that he would be able to sustain them through the 2 remaining years of the famine. It was God, he claims, who brought him to Egypt to enable them to survive. The rest of the parsha deals with Joseph sending his brothers back to Canaan to bring their families and their father to live in Egypt. Jacob at first doesn't believe that Joseph is still alive, but then he does, seemingly for no apparent reason. On the way to Egypt, he experiences one of his rare visions of God, who tells him to not be afraid of going to Egypt. His family will be made into a great nation there, and God will be with them. God would go down with them to Egypt, and God would bring them back from Egypt. It is unclear if Jacob was ever told the full details of how Joseph ended up in Egypt. Perhaps his sons wanted to spare him that agony, or perhaps they wanted to avoid bringing up unpleasant history. But it didn't really matter. What was important to Jacob was not the famine or the events that led to their current situation. What was important was that God was there with them. As far as the brothers were concerned, we really don't know how they saw things. It is unclear if they fully believed what Joseph told them about God bringing him there to sustain them. They may have been too embarrassed to question this and only too relieved to not be blamed for what they had done. But at the very end of the book of Genesis, we are shown a certain window into their perspective on things. After the death of Jacob, they send a message to Joseph, who is still the viceroy and still controls their fate to a great degree. They tell him that their father had demanded before his death that Joseph forgive his brothers for the evil that they had done to him. He wept upon hearing this, and they offered to be his slaves. Joseph then reminded them that they had nothing to fear, for he was not in the place of God. They had planned to do evil, but God switched it to good in order to save them. This watershed event of the family of Jacob going down to Egypt set the stage for the Exodus and the giving of the 10 Commandments and the creation of the Jewish people. It is hard to imagine a more pivotal event in the history of the world. What did it seem like at the time? Were the people involved aware of the vast ramifications of this event? Did they know that history was being shaped and formed right before their eyes, and that they were integral parts of that history? The answer, in all likelihood, is that they were somewhat oblivious to all that. They were simply moving. The famine was in full swing, and this was an extremely opportune way of surviving it. They weren't thinking about the exodus from Egypt. They were doing nothing other than moving to Egypt. When we examine this event from the different perspectives of the people who took part in it, we see a fascinating collage. Joseph, who was the mover and shaker of the whole thing, saw it as the hand of God at work. This was fate acting out through him in full color. This event was exactly as he saw it, an act of God to bring them to Egypt. Everything from his being sold to his rising to power and manipulating things so that they were begging for their lives before him was God unrolling fate right before their eyes. Nothing could be clearer. The brothers, for their part, saw things differently. They were relieved that they weren't being killed or worse for what they did, and certainly thrilled with being given a way of surviving the famine. But they were still suspicious of Joseph's true intent. All this talk of God being behind their evil was very noble, but they didn't really believe it. It was only a matter of time until Joseph would take revenge. To them, this event and everything that preceded it was a family drama that happened to take a temporary nice turn. As far as Jacob was concerned, none of this really mattered. He wanted to see Joseph before he died, and that single hope was granted to him. But the true significance in all this was not personal. His personal part in all this was played by Jacob, but it was to his alter ego, Yisrael, or Israel, that God appeared. This event was much greater than a meeting of a man named Jacob with his long-lost son, Joseph. It was God directing Yisrael and the Israelites who followed him into their exile in Egypt that would lead to the Exodus. This was destiny playing out a much greater role than mere survival of a famine. It was the future of the Jewish people and the moral course of the world that was being shaped. These three perspectives were all true. This is the way it is for all things in life. We see things how they appear to us, regardless of how they may appear to others. Some of us have very limited and personal perspectives, and others are occasionally gifted with broader and more ultimate perspectives. Perhaps once in a while we are able to see things as they really are, in all their simplicity and all their complexity. But this requires a certain amount of maturity and openness, and an ability to see the world through God's eyes. Shabbat Shalom.